It had been 4 years since my wife had died, and 3 years since my children had started urging me to move. They thought the family home where they had all grown up was too big for a single man. I resisted as long as I could, but realized that in the end, they were right. I had no desire to live with any of my offspring, nor did they need me. I have to admit that as I got older, I became more and more irritable. I was fine most of the time, but I developed a short temper and an intolerance for people who acted like assholes. Hell, why wouldn't I be? I'd spent my whole life being nice to people I didn't like just to be socially acceptable. Now it didn't matter anymore. After the kids and I finally came to an agreement, I started preparing. The hardest part was getting rid of my stuff. You'd be surprised how much junk a person can accumulate over a lifetime, especially if they've spent most of it in the same house. I was a little disappointed that I wasn't able to pawn more stuff off on the kids. My son, Robert, an attorney, took my Snap-on tools, and my daughter, Marcy, a doctor, agreed to take her mother's china. She was going to keep it for her daughter. Darcy, a teacher and the oldest in the group, took a grandfather clock that belonged to my father. I think they each took something so I wouldn't be offended. I had a yard sale every other week during the summer, and eventually a wholesaler of used furniture came to me and bid on what was left. It was sad to see my whole life go without a word. I was a little depressed and a little angry. I wasn't mad at my kids because they did the right thing. I was angry at myself for getting old. Blackwater Village required a contribution. The money from the family home covered that amount. I didn't have much left because I chose a studio apartment. It had just one room and a bathroom. The kitchen had a small cooking area, enough for a coffee pot and microwave, but no stove. I wasn't going to do much cooking since meals were included in the exorbitant monthly fee. There was also a small refrigerator under the countertop, which was perfect for my Fosters. Unfortunately, the room was dominated by a full-size bed. The kids surprised me with a new HD TV and a leather chair. What more could a man want? A computer wouldn't have hurt, but there were several computers with internet access in the common area that could be used. It didn't take long to get used to the daily routine. Since I always got up early, I was able to take my morning walk without being disturbed. Usually, me and a lone woman would circle the perimeter of the grounds. She smiled, but avoided making eye contact. I'd seen her a few times in the main building, but had no idea who she was. She always wore stylish suits for outings. Her hair was shoulder length and silky, like a shampoo commercial. Her hair was mixed, silver and gray. I was impressed that she was confident enough to do this. Most women dye their hair ridiculous colors in an attempt to look younger. The minimum age to enter this place was 65, so it seemed silly to me. I never understood vanity. Eventually, I learned that my companion's name was Eleanor. Eleanor was married to Frank Stryker, a retired Air Force colonel. The Strykers lived in the largest unit in the entire complex, and he flaunted that fact every chance he got. Just looking at the man made my blood boil. He was the epitome of arrogance, and I lost my temper every time I got near him. As far as I was concerned, Eleanor was a beautiful woman, and her husband treated her like shit. He didn't abuse her or do anything like that, but he took her for granted and always spoke to her in a demeaning manner. If I had said any of the things he said to my late wife Emma, I would have gotten a cast-iron skillet to the head and deserved it. Now you're wondering how I got so much useful information? The ratio of single women to single men in communities like Blackwater was very unbalanced. As soon as there was an available male in the community, the vultures would descend on him. I'm being a little harsh. These women are not vultures by any standard, just lonely widows hoping for a little attention. The metaphorical term, circling doves, is not an apt description. I am fortunate enough to have a wonderful companion at every meal. Getting them to talk about other women was not difficult at all. Unfortunately, I had to learn a lot about the women I didn't care for in order to learn a little about Eleanor. Frank Stryker loved to brag. He was always ready to talk about his brilliant military career, his great athletic skills, and his collection of awesome memorabilia. After spending a few hours on the computer, I discovered that he was not an Air Force colonel, but a lieutenant colonel in the reserve. After 20 years of service, he received a free promotion to colonel, but never reached that rank. He was never in combat and spent his entire career as a supply officer. Please understand that I am not demeaning his position or service, but questioning the way he presented himself and his status to others. If you listened to Frank, you would soon believe that he single-handedly won the Vietnam War. I had no trouble getting Frank to show me his amazing collection of expensive junk. He had an entire room filled with display cases and shelves. I saw a Mickey Mantle baseball card, an autographed O.J. Simpson soccer, and 100 other sports collectibles. A beautifully framed engraving of Whistler hung on the wall, a lithograph by Peter Max off to the side. 2 albums held pages and pages of autographs and signed photographs. He was obsessed with his possessions and bragged about each one. Eleanor sat quietly with her book while Frank methodically guided me through the department. The most interesting thing I noticed was the double beds. Several weeks passed. Eleanor and I still walked every morning, but never together. There was never a nod of acknowledgement between us. My relationship with the mistresses of the estate was steadily improving, and I used this time to improve my social skills. I also spent a lot of time observing and studying Frank. There was something he was really good at. He was an excellent tennis player and was almost a pro at golf. We went bowling one evening as a large group, and I was again amazed at his talents in the alley. I looked for a weakness I could use to get closer to Eleanor, but I didn't find one. Evening time at the Blackwater stretched slowly. Most of the occupants watched television or a movie. There were usually a few card games going on, and some of the ladies were playing mahjong, which I never understood. Frank seemed to enjoy cribbage and, to my surprise, parcheesi. Emma and I spent many quiet evenings hunched over the parcheesi game board. It was deadly. I never realized how strategic the game was until my wife destroyed me over and over again. It took months, or should I say years, before I could get over her. On 2 occasions, I got so angry that I ripped a parcheesi board in half and threw it across the room. The next day, I would embarrassingly bring home a new one and apologize to Emma for being a turd. After the kids went home, we stopped playing for some reason. I don't remember why. The only thing I took with me of value was my first edition of Mickey Spillane's The Big Kill. It didn't cost much, but I kept it because I bought it new, and it was one of the few books I actually enjoyed reading. The grammar was terrible, and it was obvious they didn't have proofreaders in those days. It's amazing how many books he sold considering that. After 30 minutes spent on the computer, I found several autographs of my favorite author for sale. I printed out 3 of them and spent the rest of the evening practicing my forgery skills. I'd never been very good at it, but hell, Frank couldn't know that. Now I had a signed first edition. That had to be worth something. The first thing I did was mention and show off my new jewel to a few buddies who were hanging around Frank. He didn't approach me right away. "Stanley, I understand you have a first edition of Mike Hammer's novel. I was wondering if I could take a look at it." I didn't say anything to the other guys about the signature on the cover of the book, but I made sure they saw it. "It would be my pleasure, Frank. I have had the book for over 40 years, and it is my pride and joy." The Colonel spent a good 5 minutes looking at the book. He checked to see if the spine was secure, read carefully the publisher's information on the front. Too bad he didn't know more about forged signatures. "That's a great piece, Stanley. Would you mind parting with it?" "Well, Frank, I don't need the money, but I might be interested in a trade or something. Why don't you think about it, and maybe you can think of something to entertain me?" I knew I had brought that book with me for some reason. It wasn't the best reason, but it did bring some excitement to a dull existence. Over the next few days, Frank tried to engage me in various activities at which he clearly excelled. He tried betting, but never said exactly what he was going to offer on his side. I was more interested in games than athletics. Poker was his first choice, but I still didn't respond. I was waiting for parcheesi. It didn't matter because I was planning on losing anyway. I just felt like I could put on a more convincing show in something I was good at. The day came when he proposed, and I reluctantly accepted. By this time, many residents had learned of the bet. I didn't really want an audience, so I agreed to one observer to clarify or witness the terms of the wager, but not to observe the game. The big day came, and Frank was damnably cocky. He had no doubt that he would beat me, and he was already flaunting it. We sat down at a secluded table in the common area and went over the rules of the game. "Mr. Stryker, I'm putting my first edition of a Mickey Spillane novel on the line. What are you offering?" "Mr. Clark, I've made you several offers over the past few weeks, but you've rejected them all. I assume you have something in mind, so I'll have to hear what it is and then make a decision. It seemed to me that we were beginning to address each other formally. It gave the wager a certain ceremonial air. I'm willing to bet my book against one evening with your wife, Eleanor. This elicited a certain reaction from my opponent. Not a violent one, but a marveled one. Without uttering a word, he expressed amazement at my boldness. Franks's friend, who sat with us to clarify the terms of the bet, was also a bit taken aback. That's just ridiculous. You don't seriously think I'd bet my wife against a silly book, do you? Charlie, would you mind leaving Mr. Stryker and I alone to discuss this like gentlemen? Charlie stood up and walked out, receiving a nod from the colonel. He walked across the room and was soon deep in conversation with the assembled group of watchers. My plan had worked perfectly. I didn't mean to upset you like this, Frank. What I'm proposing is innocent enough. All I want to do is invite Eleanor to dinner, without all the hush-hush and commitment. I'm going crazy in this place, and I need to get out for the evening. I've had dinner with every lady in this complex except Eleanor. She's the only one who can make it special for me. Just dinner, that's all. I promise, and I'll even let her pick the restaurant. Of course, you'll have to approve it and make sure she's okay with it. That's not a problem. She'll do whatever I tell her to do. When he made that statement, I realized I was doing the right thing. He didn't care about her. She was just another piece of property to him. Frank looked at Charlie and gave him a thumbs up. We were ready to start the game. Did you ever play a game as a kid where one person whispered some statement to another person and then it was passed down one by one to 10 or 20 people? By the time it got to the end, it was quite different than when it started. I was sure that the terms of our wager would come back to Eleanor in the same way. Now all I had to do was wait for the results. I could win or lose, but at least I had a chance. The game went as expected. Stryker was good, but not that good. I had 2 opportunities to block and get to the finish line, but I missed both. I was able to offer him the same situation, but he didn't even see it. We played twice as long as we should have. After the win, I handed him a book and congratulated him on a good game. The seed had been sown. I had a good night's sleep that night. The morning was beautiful, and I never felt better as I started my walk. Before I knew it, a furious Eleanor Stryker was blocking my path with her hands on her hips. Who the hell do you think you are, embarrassing me like this? I'm sorry, but this wasn't part of my plans. Did you really think I would agree to have sex with you just because my stupid husband lost a bet? The rumor chain worked just as I'd hoped. He said you'd do whatever he told you to do. What? That definitely threw the demure woman off balance. I wouldn't make up anything like that. I couldn't tell her I'd taken it out of context. When poor Frank said it, he was talking about dinner, not sex. It was to my advantage to make her think what she thought. Why would you bet such a valuable book on something you could never get? I'd put everything I have on the line to spend the evening with you. It wasn't hard. She was still furious, but seemed to be deep in thought. Turning to leave, she made a low, growling sound. Don't ever humiliate me like that again, you arrogant twerp. As Eleanor Stryker walked away, I wondered why she used the initials S.O.B. instead of just saying son of a bitch. I finally met the new woman of my dreams. Mildred Stubblebine became my companion for breakfast. She wasn't as talkative as usual, and an amused smile shone on her face for most of the meal. You have something on your mind, Mildred. What is it, exactly? She leaned across the table and chuckled lightly. Stanley, were you really going to do that? If you won the game, were you going to have sex with her? Shame on you. Why would you ask me that? We all had our fingers crossed. We were rooting for you to win. Why? We thought it would be good for her. She needs some attention. I think you're a bunch of dirty old women. I smiled broadly when I said that. Besides, a gentleman never tells. I grabbed the last triangle of toast and winked at Mildred as I left the table. It was nice to have the ladies support my campaign. As I left, Mildred was beaming from ear to ear. She now had enough information to monopolize the conversation in Blackwater all day. I hardly saw Frank that morning. I skipped lunch and took the shuttle bus to Walmart. I had a few things to buy, and I was trying to avoid more questioning as I had with Mildred earlier. Everything was fine now, but it would be easy to mess up. I made dinner on the TV and watched a couple of movies in my room before going to bed. It was already 11 o'clock when I heard a faint knock on the door. Standing in the doorway was Eleanor Stryker with a concerned expression on her face. I stepped aside and let her enter, standing in just my boxer briefs. The only light in the room came from the hallway and the red glow of the clock. I closed the door just as she threw off her robe and climbed into my bed. Not a word was spoken between us. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the light from the hallway hit my eyes again. My overnight guest had left as quietly as she had come. The 4 short hours we had spent together had been glorious. And the fact that we didn't say anything the entire time made them even better. I slept through breakfast and was surprised by a visit from my 3 ladies with Danish, juice, and hot coffee. They didn't say anything either, just smiled. I was still in my boxers. No one talked about my relationship with Eleanor. She visited me at least twice a week. My door was never locked. The Colonel seemed to calm down a bit. The bravado was gone. He spent more time on the golf course, sometimes playing 2 rounds a day. We didn't talk much anymore. His circle of friends seemed to get smaller and smaller each week. About 6 months after our Parcheesi game, Frank Stryker died of a heart attack while playing golf in Bermuda. 2 buses brought us to Colonel Stryker's military funeral at Indiantown Gap. I tried to remain inconspicuous. Eleanor sat in the front with her 2 sons and daughter. The sons seemed to be as arrogant as their father. The daughter looked like she had a broomstick shoved up her ass and sucked lemons for breakfast. It was sad to see such an elegant lady have such assholes as a child. I was thankful I didn't have the same problem. Frank Stryker's sons wasted no time loading his collectibles into their cars. The daughter seemed to have no interest in any of these things. She spent all her time with Eleanor. I only had to watch from afar. That evening, Eleanor did not come to the dining room. When I heard a knock on the door, I knew immediately that it wasn't my mistress. She was already used to just walking in. The lemon-sucking, brown-haired woman stood there, not smiling. "Stanley Clark, I'm Norma Stryker, Eleanor's daughter. May I have a moment of your time?" I was afraid to tell her no. "I'm trying to get my mother's affairs in order before I go home. There are a few things left to take care of." "Would you like a beer?" I was taken aback when she nodded yes, and even more so when she started drinking from the bottle. My money-hungry brothers have left with their loot, and I'm left to clean up the mess. I have one small problem to solve before I can leave. She swallowed half her beer in one gulp. "I don't see how I can be of any use. My mother craves the companionship she's been deprived of for years. I understand you are ready and willing to offer her what she needs, and I would like to pay you for your services." "Why on earth would you want to pay me for something I'm willing to do for free?" She finished her beer with a second sip. "I feel obligated to protect the inheritance. My father left a lot of money. It's a life annuity for my mother with the provision that it be passed equally to each of the children upon her death." "I don't want Eleanor's money. I don't need it, and I don't see any reason to separate us." "I don't want to separate you. In fact, I want you to move in with her. The board says it's okay, and Mom will like it." "What's the problem? How can we keep you both from getting married? If you marry her, things could get very messy, and it would only benefit the lawyers." "What's your solution?" "I want to hire you as a permanent companion for my mother. You can live together as husband and wife, but you will actually be an employee, not a husband. You'll have limited power of attorney, so you can make medical decisions and such, but you won't have legal marital rights." "What kind of salary are we talking about?" "I'll pay your monthly dues here in Blackwater, and I'll give you an open credit card so you can entertain Mom, like going to movies, restaurants, and the like. You can use your pension for whatever you want. You can also sell your condo. As I understand it, you will get 90% of the original price when you resell it." It all seemed pretty damn mercantile. I guess it made sense from a financial standpoint, but for me personally, it stunk to high heaven. "I'm sorry, Norma. I appreciate your offer, but it's impossible. I love Eleanor, and I really want to spend the rest of my time with her. It's been difficult for me since my wife's death. I didn't think I would ever find someone to replace her. Your mother does. but I won't let our relationship be jeopardized over money. I'll gladly sign a prenup or something, but I will not be bribed under any circumstances. From what I understand, she can give the entire annuity to her kids, and we can live just fine on what I have. Well, maybe not as well, but nice. Would you like another beer? No more beer, thanks. I've got to get back to Chicago. Can I call you at the end of the week? I'll look forward to it. In the meantime, I know a nice lady who needs someone to hold her hand. I feel obligated, and I intend to honor that obligation until you tell me otherwise. Do as you see fit, Mr. Clark. I think she's waiting for you. Norma didn't call back. Eleanor and I no longer had to hide in the shadows. We spent most nights in her cell block. We used mine from time to time just for a change. We were accepted as a couple and were comfortable in each other's company. 2 or 3 times a month I had lunch with one of the guys. I never said anything about Eleanor because I didn't want them to think I was trying to replace their mother. It was easier that way. I was proud of the fact that I didn't feel any guilt toward the kids for visiting me. They had their own lives and their own families. I felt it was important not to disrupt them. Thanksgiving was approaching, and my children did not fail to invite me to Marcy's house to spend it with everyone. I wanted to spend the day with Eleanor, so I simply told them, thanks, but no thanks. Eleanor took a little offense at me for not coming to terms with my family and introducing her to them. At one point, she hinted that I was ashamed of her. That's when I realized I had to open up the relationship. The first call I made was to Robert. I never took advantage of the fact that Robert was a lawyer. I felt it was unseemly. I decided I had to make an exception. He was thrilled with Eleanor and convinced me that his sisters would be thrilled too. He, like me, thought prenups were rude, but in this case, they were necessary. It only took him a few days to draw up papers completely protecting all of Eleanor's property from me, regardless of our relationship. That year, Christmas was spent at Robert's house. Eleanor gave me a first edition of a Mickey Spillane novel, and I gave her an engagement ring. Her acceptance into the family was unanimous. We were married in March of that year in the community room at Blackwater. Norma came to the wedding, but her brothers did not show up. I gave her a copy of the prenup, and with a wink she handed it back to me.